All right, I'm going to start the recording now in case I forget, which can sometimes happen, especially on Mondays. Welcome, everybody. I think we've got students here from Kath's group because I know Kath had a family crisis tonight, so I did send her the link. So hopefully we've got a few extra students joining us. And then also just note tonight we've got the national support session, which will start at 7:30. Time for you to have a breather after the collab. Maybe grab something to eat or something to drink, and then you'll log in using the link that I put up regarding the national support session. So this is a normal collab for Learning Unit 2, and then at 7:30 we'll have a national support session. The national support sessions don't usually take that long, usually about 30 minutes or so, if you're worried about timing for tonight. So let's get underway. Welcome everybody. I hope you've had a chance to look through Chapter 2 of your textbook on research methods before this collab, because these topics are included in our assignment, which is due next week, Monday. So hopefully you've read and have some kind of understanding of what this learning unit is about. Don't get too tied up in technicalities. At this point in time, this learning unit is really just to give you an overview of the importance of research in psychology. Because remember, in the first learning unit, we really established that psychology, like many other disciplines, has to be treated as a science. And as such, it is very much tied up in research that's been undertaken, findings from research across multiple perspectives, across multiple topics. But it really is the foundation for most of the reading and academic writing that you do in psychology. So we touch on the important points, and it really is at this point, it's just an overview. It's not taking you in too deep. You'll build on research as you go in psychology, because when you get to your honors level, you'll have a research project that you'll have to do, and that's where you really start to apply the whole process of research. But for the meantime, the objective is really that you can find research, that you can understand research in terms of what's being researched, what outcomes are found, and that kind of thing. So it really is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of research. So don't get too stressed about it. It might seem a bit like a maths or a maths literacy lesson at some points, and I'm sure you have covered some of these issues before, but this is putting it all together in the discipline of psychology for you. Okay. Right, so at the beginning of your module outline for this learning unit, you can see there the different themes. We're referring to chapter 2 of the textbook, so that's the whole of the chapter. We look at psychology as a science. We look at the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. We touch on some of the statistics that we use in psychology, and it really is just touching on them. We look at ethics in psychology, which is really important because everything has to be done in an ethical way. And we just touch briefly on evaluating research. So if that's clear for everybody, remember to look at those learning outcomes, all 12 of them, and make sure that when you finish the chapter, you can go back and achieve each of those learning outcomes, which is identified in your module outline. Okay, which is the process that we identified in our first learning unit as to how you treat these module outlines as a guide for assignments and exams and what you need to know by the end of the semester. So first of all, we just really have a look at why do we need to do research in psychology. So it is because we said psychology is a science, and as such, the way we address a science is through a formal process, and it's through a process of systematic observation. And when we make those systematic observations and we do research, it's got to be done in a way that we're trying to solve something, but whatever we come up with has to go to all of our peers, and they have to look at it, and it has to stand up to the scrutiny of our peers when we submit our psychological research. So it's not just something we write off the top of our head. It's something that is investigated formally, systematically, and can be shared and commented on and checked for its credibility. And as psychologists, we have all sorts of different strategies for investigation because it depends very much on what problem we're trying to solve, how we're trying to solve it, what our hypothesis is, how we need to collect data. There are multiple ways of doing research. So we end up with a toolbox that we use when we look at the problem we're trying to solve. We look at the best way to solve or to research that problem. So for you as sort of first years and getting into the grips of psychology, it will help you understand what you read. We do a lot of reading of journal articles, which are published research reports, and it will help you understand what you're reading. And it will also sort of facilitate the process of thinking critically, because we should never take something at face value. We need to really dig into it, and we need to look at what's been researched. We look at the approaches, we look at the results, and we need to think critically about it. So a kind of question that we could be looking at when we're doing research, an example I put up for you is, does an authoritarian parenting style impact on academic performance of children in primary school? That could be the kind of research question that you're trying to find out. But we break everything down into a question or a puzzle that we're trying to solve, and we solve it in a scientific way. And that's the importance of research. So it's really showing us that we need to think critically. So when we read research, or really when we read anything, we're asked what we're being asked. We look at what we're being asked to believe. And we ask, what is the evidence that supports it? Or how could it be interpreted? Would you need other evidence? And what are the conclusions? So very much, as I said in the first learning learning unit, is that psychology is a science. It's objective, it's not subjective. So it's not, I think that, it's the research that was undertaken concluded that. Okay, very scientific. Because if we look at things from our own perspective, there are all sorts of biases that can creep into the way we think about things. It's just part of our thinking that we say something like, oh, I knew it all along, therefore I believe it's true. Or we become very overconfident in our way of thinking, or we tend to notice things that support our beliefs rather than instances that don't. So those are distortions that can happen with our thinking if we don't take care to really critically evaluate what we're reading, especially in psychology. Okay, we tend to ignore things that we don't want to know about or that contradicts our way of thinking. So we really have to interrogate the information we read carefully. But when you read something in a journal article, and it's a published journal article, you know that that journal article has been through a process of peer review. It's been scrutinized, therefore its results are credible, and they're written by somebody who's got expertise in the discipline. So when we look at psychology as a science, we have to look that it has, as a science, like other sciences, has certain goals. And when we're doing research, we look at measurement. We're measuring and describing things in order to be able to understand things and predict things. And then we say, well, now we've got this research. How do we apply the research finding to practical problems? So psychology as a science is very much around describing something correctly using scientific research principles, explaining something, using that to predict something, and hopefully going on to possibly modify a behavior. So it sort of looks at measurement and description is to develop measurement techniques, because obviously if we choose something to be measured, we've got to know how we're going to measure it. So it's being able to describe what we want to measure very carefully and precisely. So an example could be in studying the effectiveness of muscle relaxation techniques in reducing anxiety, a psychologist must first develop a means of measuring anxiety. So we can't just say, oh, we're going to measure anxiety and just leave it as a concept. We have to do what's called operationalizing it, which means how do we measure anxiety? And there are, over the years, multiple questionnaires and surveys have been done that measure different components of anxiety. And often those kinds of questionnaires are available to us as psychologists to use again because they have been approved. But it's kind of saying we need to actually define what we mean by anxiety, then how do we measure it? And that's what we have to understand. So we want to measure anxiety in order to be able to understand it, okay, and to be able to predict it. So we have what is called a hypothesis, and we'll go into this again shortly when we look at the steps in research. But a hypothesis is basically a statement that we make as psychologists or as researchers about the relationship between things. So the example I've got in the bottom is how X affects Y. So if we have two variables, X and Y, we want to know, how does X affect Y? Are we able to make a prediction of Y if we know what X is? Does X cause Y? So that's what we try to find out. We have to give ourselves that statement about the variables that we want to look at in order to be able to explain something and predict something. And the variables are those kinds of conditions or events or behaviors that are controlled or observed in a study. Okay, so we'll look at those again shortly, but generally you have an independent variable that can be changed by the researcher, and Y could be your dependent variable. So what happens to Y, the dependent variable, depends on what is happening with that independent variable. So there are things that can be controlled and measured in order to determine a relationship between things. And then ultimately, we want to apply what we find to practical problems. That's why we do the research. That's why we publish the research. That's why we read the research, is to see how we can actually apply it. All right, so does everybody understand then why psychology becomes a science, an empirical science? So therefore, okay, it's to build towards a better understanding of behavior. And generally what psychologists do is they construct theories which is used to explain a set of observations. So it allows us to move from describing something to understanding something. And of course, because it's scientific, it must be testable. So if somebody else picks up a research report and says, well, I would like to do that again, it's pretty much mapped out in a way that somebody else can pick it up and say, well, I want to test it myself. And with theory and developing theory and doing research to come up with a theory, the process is, it's quite reflective. At each step builds on the next step, and you look and you can revise it. So it's a gradual process. You might want to go back and change something and then build on it again, and you keep going back until you've got a finished project. And again, it's scientific. So we're going to use the scientific methods to make observations in order to collect data and improve on the quality of human lives. Okay, so that's the general understanding as to why psychology is a scientific discipline. So when we come to a scientific investigation, and we'll elaborate these on the next slide, but there are steps. It's not just gung-ho approach that you go in and just find a whole lot of people to send a random questionnaire out to and then shove it all on a spreadsheet and try and find a result. You've actually got to follow a process. And the process is numbered out in steps. So the very first thing that you look at is what is your problem statement? You look at the rationale of your problem. You develop a scientific research question. What is the question you want to ask? You develop a hypothesis, which is what you're trying to prove. You then say, well, how do I do this research? How do I design it? You look at how I'm going to collect the data for my research. How do I analyze the research? And then how do I report the results? So it's a process. You really start from step 1, and then you conclude in the final step 7, where you actually report those results. And at any time, you can go back to a previous step and refine it if it's not quite what you are looking for. So it's very much a scientific process of exploration of information and data. So what I've done now, in order just to clarify those steps so that you understand them, is I found an example that you can use, which we'll just quickly read through together. And it's an abstract from a research paper on the provision of telehealth care interventions, I think in the Eastern Cape. So the abstract tells us that adequate healthcare services are often not available in rural and remote areas, and this problem is expected to grow worse in the near future. Telehealth interventions represent a strategy for addressing access to care problems. We examined and compared attitudes towards medical and mental health care delivered via the telehealth applications amongst adult, rural, and urban primary care patients. The N there that's got N112 and N78 is really the number of people who were in each sample. Okay, so in the rural sample, there were 112 people, and in the urban sample, there were 78 people. We also examined attitudes towards telehealth applications among a subset of patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, a group likely in need of specialized services. Both urban and rural patients were receptive to receiving medical and psychiatric services via telehealth. There were a few meaningful differences across variables between urban and rural patients. There were no meaningful differences by PTSD status. These findings support the feasibility of telehealth applications, particularly for rural patients who may not be able to access or receive needed services. So that's an abstract. And when you look at a research paper that's published, it always starts with an abstract, which is basically a summary of what the research was about, how it was done, and what the results were. Okay, so you always look at the abstract first, but you'll start to understand that the more you engage with research material. So the very first step in our research problem is to identify a problem, which is the problem statement. It's like the big picture. What is the actual problem that's going on here? So we could define the problem here as adequate healthcare services are not often available in rural and remote areas, and this problem is expected to get worse in the near future. That's our big picture problem, that these healthcare services are not available for mental and physical well-being, and the problem could get worse. So the rationale says to us, okay, so we have a problem, but why do we need to investigate it further? How, if we study this problem, is it going to advance knowledge? It's almost like a justification. So the rationale for doing this, for addressing this problem, is because telehealth interventions represent a strategy that can be used to address access to healthcare services. At present, there are no studies on attitudes of patients towards telehealth service provision. So what it's saying to us, we need to do this because we have this problem. The problem is going to get bigger. Rebecca, I'll come to that. You'll come to it in the NSS, so don't stress about that right now. But as long as you get the understanding that you can see the difference between the rationale and the problem. So we're going to do it because it's going to give us a strategy to address access, and at the same time, there's no other studies done for this. So it's like a unique study in a way. All right, so that's the rationale. Why are we going to do it? We develop our research question. So in order to do that, we have to say, okay, well, what's the question we're going to ask people? We can't just go in and say, you know, how do you feel about telehealth care? There's multiple questions that could be asked. But for this purpose of this study, the question that could be asked is telehealth an acceptable method of health service provision in both rural and urban communities? We want to look at people's attitudes and say that if we roll out this service, is it acceptable to people? That's actually what we want to do. That's our research question. Is telehealth an acceptable method of health service provision? We've got to have a question we're trying to find the answer to in our studies. So in order to do the question, we've got to come up with a hypothesis, which is about a tentative statement about the relationship between two or more variables. And remember that a good hypothesis is one that can be tested. It's about a prediction of what will happen. And in our research, we've got to prove or disprove the hypothesis. So we spoke about variables, and variables must be given those definitions so we know what to measure. So we could say our hypothesis is going to be, we've got our question. Our question is telehealth an acceptable method? And our hypothesis that we're going to prove could be something like community members from urban communities will be more open to non-traditional methods of healthcare provision than members from rural communities. So that's saying, okay, well, there's our hypothesis. we're going to look at urban community members, and we're going to look at rural community members, and we might say that urban community members are more open. So therefore, we need to make sure we can identify what the words more open might be, and we need to operationalize it. And remember, we're not getting into details here, but I'm just showing you we've got to be very clear about what we're actually measuring. Another hypothesis could be is that both urban and rural community members will be open to health service provision via a telehealth line. So that's like the detail of our question, what we're actually going to be doing in order to answer our question. We then have to say, okay, we've got our question, we've got our hypothesis, what happens next? How do we do this? We need a plan. Do we do qualitative research or quantitative research? And we'll come to that a little bit later, but I'm just showing you how the research design fits into the steps here. So qualitative research is, we're going to say our research design, we're going to say we're going to do it qualitatively. So it tells us a step-by-step plan of how research will be done. Qualitative research will be conducted through descriptive research using survey design with community members who've been identified by local healthcare providers as non-chronic but requiring monthly support services. That could be how we're going to do our research. We're going to go and find people in a certain population, and we're going to ask them questions through a survey. Research will be to explore attitudes of these patients towards the provision of healthcare telehealth applications. So how do we do it? There's our steps. We're going to find the people in the right population. We're going to ask them some questions, and this is what we're going to be exploring. So it's just your design of your research. We then say, okay, well, we're going to do this. How are we going to go and do it? How are we going to collect our data? We can't go and collect from the entire rural population or the entire urban population. So we're going to choose a sample. So we're going to choose a focus group, possibly of 100 members who will complete the questionnaires. How do they get the questionnaires? The primary healthcare workers will be responsible for handing out and collecting the questionnaires. Okay, so it's actually the steps that we take in collecting our data. Once we've got our data, we say, okay, now we've got all this information. How do we analyze it? Okay, so for every research design, there's a way of analyzing data. So if you're collecting quantitative or numerical data, you might use a statistical procedure. But if you're doing qualitative data, you might do a thematic analysis. But you'll say, how is that data that I've got all of this data, all of this information, how do I actually go about making sense of it? What do I use? And then the final thing will be is that you report your results. So that hopefully gives you a nice little practical example of how those steps work. And yeah, if you've got any questions, you're welcome to ask me. But yeah, there's 7 steps to the research process. You can have a mixed methods research design, certainly. For this sort of level, we're just going to look really at the 2, but often you have a mixed methods approach that can actually use both types of design in a research project. Okay, so the advantages are we get clarity and precision, and we get objective data through thorough. We're incredibly thorough. Everything is documented. Okay, so it's objective data and it's put together in a very thorough way. So those are our steps for our research project, or our scientific investigation. So as I mentioned before, when we look at our approaches to research, there's 2 types of approaches we can use without considering a combined approach at this stage. We're just going to keep to these basics. So we have qualitative research and we have quantitative research. Those are 2 different approaches, and they're used in 2 different kinds of situations, and they use different techniques for doing research and collecting data and analyzing data. So if we look at qualitative research, and we have qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative always is about quality. It's a bit like, I always think of it in my head as long sentences, as written. It's trying to get deep. It's looking at the quality of something. Quantitative is more around measurement and numbers. So that's the way to differentiate between the 2. So if we have qualitative research, the approach to it's used when we want to understand and interpret social interactions. So we want to get more subjective responses. We're not trying to go out and get this information from thousands of people. We're going to take a smaller sample size where we can go deeper in things like interviews with open-ended questions. We do observations. It's very subjective. it's not usually representative of the broader population, but it's giving you in-depth knowledge of a specific group of people that you want to find out more about. Okay, so think about, there's a picture there, qualitative, just have a little picture in your head of sort of open-ended interviews and themes and questioning and observation. Okay, so it's very written, and that kind of thing, which is why we say we do thematic analysis, and there's a certain way of interpreting this data. Your quantitative research, however, is that's your sort of bigger sample sizes where you want to test things. It's very numerical. We really want to test our hypothesis. Does X cause Y? What is the effect of X on Y? We want to measure things. We want to assess cause and effect relationships. We want to be able to make predictions. So it can definitely be generalizable to much larger sample sizes, and it's based on numbers and usually has statistical analysis involved with it. So that's an overview. We'll just dig into those a little bit more. So when we go back, we talk to our quantitative research design. Those are our, you will use probability when you start to do inferential statistics, okay, because that probability is about predicting things as well. So your quantitative, that's your numerical, is very much an sort of experimental type of research design where you have variables that are manipulated or held constant. Remember Skinner with his rat in the Skinner box, and he was measuring if he pushes the lever, maybe how long it takes before the rat picks up the food or before the rat pushes the lever. So he's measuring, he's controlling things. So that's where we have the independent variable. That's the condition or event that's manipulated by the experimenter. So we could be looking at the example I've put there, are test scores impacted by the amount of time sleeping the night before a test? So that's something we could assess quantitatively. We can measure things, we can look at things. So the independent variable that can be manipulated is how many hours sleep before a test. Maybe as an experimenter, you put a person in a controlled laboratory and you don't let them sleep. You maybe let them sleep for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours before a test. And what are the marks in the final psychology exam will be the dependent variable. So the marks are dependent on how many hours sleep before a test, which can be, in the case of a true experiment, manipulated. But we also have to bear in mind, as just an aside, that other times there are other variables that could compete with the independent variable in explaining an outcome, such as the study environment that the student is in at any given time. So a question that we can have is, does the introduction of rewards increase a certain behavior? Does exposure to violent TV images have an impact on aggression? So therefore we could manipulate the exposure, which is the independent variable, and then we'd have to have a way of measuring. We would need to operationalize the term aggression, so we have a way of measuring it, which would be the dependent variable. So it's very much about measurement and control by the researcher. And sometimes you might have experimental groups and you might have control groups, but it would all be part of the research design as to how that particular wants to set up his experiment. And again, we also have to remember that sometimes things are not always perfect, which is when research studies are done. You often have to control for other things, such as making sure that the study actually answers the question without any kind of biases. You have things called internal validity and external validity. So I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but it could be something about how are the people selected who take part in the study. You know, maybe you might be selecting students who are actually all the top performing students. So therefore, how valid is your research when maybe you've got students who are generally are better than other students, regardless of what situation they can find them in. So you would take a random sample, maybe say you take some from the bottom of the mark schedule and some from the top and some from the middle. So it's important to look at all of those conditions before you start the test to make sure that whatever you do, the results can't be questioned. Okay, you remove any form of bias. Maybe you might select the wrong sample size. You want to generalize something, but you only select 5 people to test on. How generalizable is that when you've taken such a small sample from your population? So it's just understanding that there can be threats to research, and the researcher has to look at those as part of their research design. The other kind of is there a margin of validity? Um, yeah, there is going to be a margin of validity. It really depends on the question that's being asked. Looking back at previous studies, looking at when somebody publishes a research report, they'll say at the end things that can be done again, maybe better, or things that can be improved upon. So it's called a margin of error, and that will be sort of a later kind of statistical principle that you apply. So quasi-experimental is a kind of design where you can't control everything. You have to understand you can't control everything. Descriptive is a snapshot summary of thoughts to determine frequency. There could be a survey design, which is like descriptive research, asking a large sample about attitudes and behavior. And then we start to look at prevalence and distribution and associations, and we look at it statistically. And there could be a correlational design, which involves different variables and assessing relationships between the variables. And we'll touch on that again a little bit later. I'm always just cognizant of time sometimes with these collabs, but you're welcome to ask me any questions afterwards if I haven't covered something that you would like to know more about in any further detail. So within that, there are different kinds of designs that can be used. Okay, so there's a little table summary that says a descriptive research design. Our goal is to create a snapshot of the current state of affairs, and every kind of design has its advantages and disadvantages. So it's important just to look at those and be aware of them when you're doing some kind of research. So the advantages of descriptive research is provides a relatively complete picture of what is occurring at any given time, allows the development of questions for further study. But a disadvantage could be does not assess relationships amongst variables, okay, because we're not measuring or looking at variables there, maybe unethical if participants do not know that they're being observed. A correlational design looks at relationships between 2 or more variables, for example, X and Y. The advantage is allows testing of expected relationships and making predictions, and it can assess these relationships in everyday events. But sometimes the disadvantage, there are causal relationships, things that would happen anyway between the variables, which it can't really pick up. So again, when we look at our research design, we need to be very careful about looking at previous research that's been done, how has it been done, what could be done better, what has the researcher said at the end to improve on something or to find something else to measure. So we do look at that in our design. So our qualitative research, remember that's more writing, more text, more looking in depth. So it's really when experiments can't be done or we want to go deeper into a subject of interest with us. So it's about collecting data. It's non-numeric. It helps us explore how decisions are made, and it gives us detailed insight. For reaching such conclusions, the data that is collected should be holistic, it should be rich and nuanced, and you find those findings through careful analysis. So there's quite a process of, once you've got this data, how you do a thematic analysis and how you extract from that. But the main point to understand here is, why would you be doing this? Okay. So the different kinds of qualitative research is observational. You can go and observe in a natural setting. There's no intervention. You've done nothing. Maybe in child psychology, you want to observe children at play. So you sit outside of a playground and you observe children while they are engaging in some kind of fantasy play activity. You can have a case study design, which is like an in-depth observation of someone, of an individual or a group, where you collect a series of case studies. And you could have some kind of design that's called phenomenology design, which is basically, it's about an experience. It's about world and the reality that we live in. How we live is some kind of socially constructed experience, and it's about individuals' everyday experiences. It's subjective experience, but it's also essential. So when we look at qualitative design, it's important in investigating complex psychological phenomena that cannot be studied experimentally. The results cannot be generalized, and generally you'll have a small number of participants. So when we look at the design, and especially the phenomenology design, we're asking someone to look at an experience they've had, something about what was the experience like, what does the experience mean, what are people's thoughts or subjective thoughts about something. So it's really digging much deeper into somebody's understanding of a situation. So those are 3 different kinds of designs you can do in qualitative research. Okay, and there are others, and there are mixed ways of doing them too. As we said, with mixed methods. So when we look at collecting the data, so as you've seen and heard in the last few slides, there obviously are different ways to collect data depending on which research approach you want to do. So if we're going to do the quantitative methods, remember that's the numerical way of collecting data, we can look at doing standardized tests. So that's almost like I can collect all the information from your assignments that you submit next week, and I do some kind of analysis on the data to see which questions you've done better than others, what's the average, what's the highest, what's the lowest, what's the range, to see how you've done or how you've coped with the course content. So that's a standardized test. A norm reference test is where maybe there's an IQ test that is marked against a sort of a model answer that's been done or provided from a population to see how you compare to the population. So if we talk about IQs, where your IQ sits based on your test compared to how the population does on the test. So that's a norm reference test, and using things like questionnaires that can be marked or scored, but ultimately giving some kind of numerical answer. Your qualitative methods, which is your sort of more nuanced, written, thematic, case studies, interviews. Obviously, interviews can be face-to-face, can be telephones, can be focus groups. Interviews can be structured interviews, so you have a set of questions you'll ask. It could be an unstructured interview where you allow the participant to speak and you take notes, or it could be semi-structured where there's a sort of sample set of questions, but it allows you as the interviewer to gain more depth where you need to. We do observations, like I said, just general field studies where you observe from afar. You've got laboratory design observations where you observe somebody in a laboratory setting, or just observing a person while they're going about their activities. And part of also qualitative research, and a thing we don't think of research, is a literature review is research. So often you'll see a research article that's done, and the objective of the research article is to look at research that has been done and maybe identify gaps in research. So looking back through documents, historical documents, personal documents, public documents, research documents, cultural documents. So you actually use documents as the source of your research. So again, you have primary data and secondary data. Primary data are the direct forms that we include, surveys, questionnaires. Secondary data is indirect ways. Yes, correct. The norm reference tests are basically, if it might say this is what the results are of the population, how do you fit into this population? Where are you on the curve compared to the rest of the population? And part of the research, initial research, would have been to design it, to do the test, to create some kind of statistical analysis, to then say, okay, here's the test. Now you do the test with somebody else and you see where they fit in to the population. Okay, what norm referenced is. Secondary data collection is indirect. Like meta-analysis is a design where we systematically assess previous research studies. Like I said to you, it's going back to previous research. And quantitative methods, that's numerical, comprise questionnaires and tests, while qualitative really is interviews, observations, and documents. Okay, so those are the different types of data collection methods. So when we look at statistics now, and we're still looking at we're looking at the numerical data and our statistics, is we use statistics for 2 things. The first thing we use statistics for is to describe the data that we've got. Okay, so we're describing we get a whole lot of information in from a group of people, and we need to be able to describe the data that we've got. So that's about organizing our data, summarizing all this data, simplifying it, and describing it. And the second part is inferential statistics, which is allowing us to infer things. Remember, inferential means infer something. It's about helping us make judgments and predict what might happen in the future. So we take the sample size of 2,000 people, and we want to say we sampled 2,000 people from the rural Eastern Cape on their views on telehealthcare. Therefore, if we take this sample, we can now say the whole of the Eastern Cape or the whole of South Africa. So we're going to take what we get from our sample and infer that that can now be applied to the whole population. So inferential statistics, that's inferring, makes reference about a population using data that we've already got from our sample. It allows us to compare data, make, do hypotheses and make predictions. It's used to explain the chance of occurrence of an event. So that's our probability. What is the probability that this can now be found true for the rest of the population? It tries to reach conclusions about a population, and it can be achieved by probability. And the descriptive side is the initial thing where we describe the statistics, about our raw data, helping to organize it, analyze it. How do we present it? It's used to describe a situation. It explained already known data and limited to a sample or population having a smaller size, and it can be achieved with the help of charts, graphs, tables, etc. So those are our two types of statistics we look at. We describe our data, and then we say, well, with this data that we have, what can we predict that will happen in the future to a larger size population? So like we said, descriptive statistics is a way that we analyze our data. So picture a spreadsheet full of results of a survey you've done. It's numerical data. So our aim with descriptive is to summarize and describe the data in a meaningful way. So like I said to you, the class marks on an assignment. How do I take my whole spreadsheet of your marks and how do I explain them to the program manager? Okay, so I look at measures of central tendency, which we'll cover quickly now. I look at variability, I look at correlation. Those are some of the tools that I use to describe my data to my program manager so I can explain how well you've understood psychology this semester. And you know these terms. If you, regardless of when you finished your school years, these are terms that have been part of our maths literacy set of information since we were young. So when we've got our set of data, how do we describe it? We look at our mean, which is our average. Okay, so within our sample, what is the average score? We look at what could be the median, which is the middle value when they're all put in numerical order. And we look at the mode, the number that occurs most often. So those are what we mean by measures of central tendencies. Okay, so what sits around the average and how do we work it out? So if we look at the numbers given below, which was the goals scored over the last 7 games by a particular soccer player, first match he scored 3, then 4, then 6, 6, 7, 8. So the mean is the average. You add them all together and you divide by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We'll give you a mean of 5. The mode is the most common number, which is 6. The median is the middle number, which is 6. And the range, which is the largest and to the smallest, we're doing it over 7 numbers. So very simple math lit terms that is just saying to you then what are these things of statistical analysis that we do when we start to look at descriptive statistics, and we've got a whole bunch of information we can analyze. We also have to look at the fact that the spread of data, okay, so it's about the variability. So we're trying to find that central point. So we always have to remember that you might have outliers. You might have someone who got 0. If you've got a test out of 100 and you've got someone who got 0 and someone who got 100, but generally most of the marks are sitting around the middle. we need to be cognizant of the fact that if the data is spread out, if there's a lot of variability in the data, it might not always be representative. And there are techniques in statistical analysis that allow you to cope with that variability, but we don't go into that now. It's just understanding that your data set can have these outliers on either end that could skew some of the results that you get. So you compensate for those with certain statistical tools. Your variance and your standard deviation is basically just that. It's how the values are spread out from that middle point. Okay, and what you'll see and what you'll learn is that's a normal curve. Okay, it's called a bell curve where your averages sit in the middle, but on either side you've got some level of variance, and there's a formula for calculating the standard deviation. Which again, we don't need to know now, so please do not panic about it. And when it gets to a point of statistical analysis, there are all sorts of computer programs that are used to plug all of these things into that actually give you the outputs that you need. It's just understanding that there can be these things that we have to accommodate for when we're looking at sets of large sets of numbers. Correlation is always very interesting, and it is a kind of statistical analysis that looks at the relationship between our two variables, x and y. And often we use the word correlate. In our everyday language, we use the word correlate. It's about what is the relationship between two things. Is there a correlation between what I cook for supper and my husband's mood when he goes to bed at night? You know, we're looking at, does the supper, which is the independent variable, impact on his mood? It could be, I mean, I don't know why I'm thinking about that, because maybe because I'm about to cook supper after this, but it's about looking at relationships, looking at the relationships between X and Y. So we have something called a positive correlation, a negative correlation. Positive correlation means that there is a relationship between two things, between X and Y. There is a relationship, okay? And as the one thing increases, so does the other. So the positive correlation is heading up there towards the right. You see the numbers are quite close together along that line, and it's telling you that every time X increases, Y increases. There is a relationship going on there. A negative correlation, so for example there, the hours spent studying could be your Y, that is your independent variable, and the mark you get is your dependent variable. So the more hours you spend studying, the higher your mark. There's a positive correlation there. So the more hours you do spend, the higher your mark. It's there. It's part of the research. We've got the results. We've proved it, that there is a relationship between those two things, that they're positively correlated. A negative correlation also still tells us there is a relationship between two things, but as the one thing increases, the other thing decreases. So it's not telling us there's no relationship. It's saying there is, but it's just the other way around. So for example, the number of cigarettes you smoke, the independent variable, okay, and X depends, your life expectancy is your X, your dependent. So your life expectancy depends on the number of cigarettes you smoke. So the more cigarettes you smoke, the less your life expectancy. There is a correlation, but as the one increases, the other decreases. Okay, so it's talking about relationships. If there is absolutely no relationship between two things, we've proved it, we've done the statistical, we've plotted our graph, and your dots are all over the place, it says to you, there's no relationship between these two things. And that might be something you're trying to prove. You might be trying to prove there is no relationship. So I want to try and prove that there is a relationship. I can predict it's positive. That's what I want to say. And my data actually can prove otherwise. And that's absolutely fine. Or your data might prove there is no relationship. That's what we're trying to test. Okay, so we describe our statistics and we learn to make predictions about things. So when you have your correlations, if you don't look at the top graphs, look at the middle line of graphs. Your correlations generally, in the middle is naught. Naught is no correlation. Okay, minus one is a perfect positive correlation, and minus one is a perfect negative correlation. So if you do this statistical analysis on your two variables, and it comes up to you that they've got a correlation of 0.98, that means you've got nearly a perfect positive correlation. If your computational analysis says to you, well, the correlation is minus 0.98, it means you've got pretty much a perfect negative correlation. As one goes up, the other goes down. If your statistical analysis comes up with naught, it means that you have got no correlation. Okay, so that is how your correlation is done. It's plotted onto a graph, and the statistical procedure will give you that correlation, which gives you the power to make predictions. So the ability to predict something based on the other variable. Okay, it doesn't tell us the cause and effect. It doesn't tell us that X causes Y. But it does tell us that they are related. And in order to study something, you need to know that two things are related before you really take the study any further. Otherwise, what's the point? It's not giving us the cause, it's just telling us that there is a relationship. Okay, I hope that's clear. There's lots of information available online if you struggle with any of these concepts. There are so many videos and YouTube videos that can help you. So then we move on. So we've done descriptive, okay? So we've learned how to describe our data and understood how describing data works. Then, like I said, it's about what can we infer. So after we've described it and we've summarized it, we then say, okay, well, let's interpret it and let's draw conclusions. Therefore, we make predictions and inferences from our data. Does the data actually support the hypothesis that you put forward? So the hypothesis put forward would be that urban populations are more, I can't remember the word we used, not more, would be more willing to use telehealth care. Does our data, does all the information we've got test that hypothesis? Does it say, yes, they would, or does it say, no, they wouldn't? Are we, what are we doing with our data that helps us answer that hypothesis? So we're drawing it from our sample of 100 people, or N was 78, or whatever the number was given. And then we say, okay, we've got it for our sample. If we've selected a sample correctly, we should then be able to generalize it to the population. Okay, but it's really important when we do that, that we have selected our sample correctly. So for example, if you want to discuss depression, when you select your sample, you need to select patients who are suffering from depression. So it's important you do select your sample from the correct population. And then we also have to be able to say, because sometimes our findings might be due to chance. They really might. So we have to rule out the fact that chance weighs in on what we find. So we do something called the statistical significance, which again is another element we apply when we are doing our data analysis, which you don't have to stress about now. Okay, but it's called a level of statistical significance that tells us that what the chance is. So you factor that in. You factor in something like there's a 5% chance that our hypothesis was wrong, which allows us then to draw conclusions and make predictions. So again, it's just a term to understand that when we start inferring, we still have to be cognizant of elements of chance, of our population was selected incorrectly, that we rule out all of those things that can impact on our results. Okay, so that's sort of the overview of the statistics component. And it's just, as I said, it's really just touching on the basics. It's enough so that when you start to read something, you've got, oh, okay, now I understand they're doing a qualitative study, they're doing a quantitative study. This is why the results are presented in this way or in that way. Okay, just to give you guys an overall understanding. When you read something, you'll be able to actually understand what they're talking about. Second to final part is ethics. Ethics is exceptionally important in psychology because we've gone beyond the stage of working with animals like our behaviorists all those years ago. We're working with people. And when you work with people, just like a doctor, a psychologist or a researcher is also bound by a code of ethics. It's really important that when any research is done or undertaken, that the ethical component is considered right at the beginning, and your research is written up to show that you have considered and followed all the guidelines required. In fact, when you do a study, it generally has to go through an ethics review committee before it can be even put to the research can actually be undertaken. You have to submit it in order for it to be approved to make sure that it is ethically sound. So when we talk about ethics, we're talking about things like protecting the well-being of participants. They have to be protected up against, I mean, you have to weigh it up. I mean, this might benefit science, but you can't harm the individual. It's like putting someone there and putting 1,000 volts into their brain to see which part of the hippocampus lights up. It's not ethically correct to do that to somebody in a general research sort of study. Participants have to be able to make an informed decision. So you can't just say you're participating. You have to actually sit them down, explain to them what the research is about, explain to them that they've got the ability to actually opt out if they want to, and get them even to read and to sign a consent form. Lamise, I don't know if you've want to ask a question. Do you want to pop it in the chat if you do? Okay, you can't just go and deceive people at all. Any deception has to be justified. That again, we said participants can withdraw at any time, and you have to tell them the risks explicitly. Even if you put it in the document they read up front, you've got to outline what the risks are. You basically have to debrief the participants. So what is the true nature of the study? So you can't hide anything. And anything, like with medical practice, the results have to remain confidential. You're taking people's personal experiences, people's data, and so confidentiality is utmost. So when you look, there's a nice, quite a large amount of reading in your chapter, which goes into those in a bit more detail with some good examples, but it's important to understand that ethical guidelines are imperative when it comes to research. Okay,
Hi,
main being
Rebecca.
voluntary. Hi,
Sorry about
do you
that.
want
My
to?
permissions weren't on. Rebecca, I just wanted to find out with regards to the ethics in, psychological research, why is it that some of the uploaded information hasn't been accredited if it is such a, serious process to go through a board, etc.?
How?
Because
Sorry, yeah.
we as students are often left to decipher for ourselves whether or not it's been through this rigorous um, you know I can't quite find the word for it, but basically like it needs to be accredited, yet we are still faced with deciphering that for ourselves.
Well, I think just generally by the fact before people can publish research, it will have to have an ethical clearance attached to it. So by virtue of the fact that it's been published, um, it has already gone through and has got an ethical clearance to it. So I don't think you have to worry about it, which is why when we look at research, it's really important to see who is writing the research, and it's got to come from an expert in the field, and it's got to come as be peer reviewed. So when you look at those things, that you know that all of its ethical obligations have been met. If that makes sense to you, you don't have to worry about ethics, because once a paper is published, you know that it has gone through those processes. So all we're saying here is to you is that as researchers or potential researchers, it's important to understand that all of those processes have sat in the background, and the research that is published is ethically sound, if that makes
Okay,
sense
thank
to
you
you.
so much.
Okay. All right, so that's your ethics. And the final part is it's basically evaluating research. So it's like I said to you in the beginning, it's about critical thinking. We can't always conclude that research is error-free. So again, the ability to replicate the study, that's what reliability is. It's saying, if I take the study, will I get the same results? If you don't get the same results, if the results are completely different, then you know that there was an error in the original research, that it wasn't very reliable. But often those are tests that the researcher does to make sure that the results actually are reliable. And we, again, like I said in the beginning, there's all sorts of biases that can come in. Hi, Tanaya. Um, around how the participants were selected, how the sample was selected, how the things have been measured. So it's just understanding when we evaluate research, we have to be cognizant of evaluating from sort of multiple perspectives and checking for biases. And one of the things the research should do is to check, like the validity internal check, that none of those biases are actually influencing the results. And of course, if you're doing interviews with people, one of the ways is the self-report. If you're sitting with someone doing a case study or doing some kind of open-ended interview, how are people reporting themselves? Is the information honest? Could there be some kind of social desirability bias in there? So you have to sort of build in controls that minimize those threats to the evaluation of the research. All right, so that's qualitative and quantitative research methods. As I say, we're just touching on the tip of the iceberg. And for now, for this year, this is all you need to know. When you get into second year, third year, you'll go into this in far more detail, getting through to your honors, where you go into a lot of information about research and conducting research. Tanya says, I'm looking into Abraham Maslow regarding his theory of self-actualization. Yeah, Tanya, have you got a question there, or is it just say if his method was looking to allow people to do good? Again, we have to look at where Maslow was, but I think Maslow's approach was really a case study approach. So he looked at people's subjective experiences and he analyzed them. He would have had a thematic analysis for analyzing them. He would have tried to draw conclusions. So again, how conclusive is the research? But, he chose a number of people who he believed had achieved a state of self-actualization, and then he would have applied a process of thematic analysis and looked for similarities between different case studies. So, again, it's how in depth you want to go in researching Maslow's research. But, I think it tells you that that's what he does in terms of he identified people who he believed, and he looked at autobiographical evidence from them, looking for themes. So if the themes apply across numerous people, qualitative studies method. Okay, so that means it's about lived experiences, Taylor. So we spoke a lot about in the history of psychology and Africanization, is that the qualitative, because you're asking a specific group of people about their specific experiences, decolonizing was making everybody the same. By removing that, you're saying as a group of people, you have your own lived experience, and it's important that we understand what that experience is. So that's what it is. It's a tool to say that we can't just generalize everything to being white, Western, and male. We have to look at things as being African or Asian, racial, a racial group, a religious group, but specifically with decolonization, it's saying as a group of people, you have your own lived experience, and we need to understand that, not see it from a context of a sort of worldwide context, which therefore wouldn't make sense. So that's what it means. It's allowing us to dig deep into lived experiences. Okay, I won't keep you because it's just after 7. I'm going to stop recording. I'm going